Lesson 8. Wisdom for Righteous Living. Memory text. So teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Psalm chapter 90 verse 12. This verse from the book of Psalms, attributed to Moses, emphasizes the importance of wisdom and mindfulness in the face of life's brevity and uncertainty. Psalm chapter 90, verse 12, reminds believers of the transient nature of life and the importance of living wisely in light of eternity. Law, grace, and wisdom are all part of the complexity of the human spiritual journey and the profound nature of divine mercy. The concept of law represents the divine standards or commandments that govern human behavior. These laws are often seen as guidelines for righteous living and moral conduct. However, humans are inherently flawed and incapable of fulfilling the law perfectly. This is where the concept of grace comes in. Grace is the unmerited favor and forgiveness bestowed upon humanity by a loving and merciful God, particularly through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Grace is seen as the means through which humans can find redemption and salvation, despite their inability to fulfill the demands of the law.
Your word I have hidden in my heart. Sections of Psalm chapter 119 emphasize the importance of keeping God's commandments and the blessings that come from doing so. The psalmist begins by emphasizing the blessedness of those whose way is blameless, who walk in the law of the Lord with wholehearted devotion. Verses 3 to 5 highlight the importance of seeking God diligently and not straying from His commandments. Verses 7 and 8, the psalmist expresses a desire to learn and keep God's statutes, expressing gratitude and praise for His righteous judgments. Verses 9 to 11 emphasize the importance of keeping God's precepts and statutes, seeking guidance to not wander from His commands. In verses 14 to 16, the psalmist expresses joy and delight in God's testimonies and statutes, treasuring them above earthly wealth. Verse 161 expresses awe and reverence for God's word and declares His love for it. In verse 163, the psalmist acknowledges that true believers hate falsehood and love God's law. Verses 164 and 165 tell us that despite facing persecution and adversaries, the psalmist remains steadfast in keeping God's commandments and praises Him for His faithfulness and righteousness. In verses 166 and 167, the psalmist finds joy and peace in God's commandments and expresses a desire for peace and salvation according to God's promises. The psalmist continues in verse 168, affirming his hope and trust in God's word and promises, declaring his commitment to keeping God's commandments until the end. Keeping God's commandments involves wholehearted obedience, diligence, praise, and delight in His word. The blessings that come from keeping God's commandments include walking blamelessly, experiencing joy and delight in God's word, and receiving His guidance and wisdom in life.
Teach us to number our days. In Psalms 91 to 17, God's grace fits in as the antidote to the human predicament described in the passage. The psalm begins by acknowledging God as the eternal dwelling place of His people throughout all generations. God's eternal nature contrasts with the transient nature of humanity, highlighting His stability and faithfulness. The psalmist reflects on the brevity of human life and the transient nature of time. In contrast to human frailty, God is depicted as the eternal and unchanging Creator, who existed before the mountains were formed and before the world was brought forth. The psalmist acknowledges the consequences of human sinfulness and the divine anger that results from it. However, even in the face of divine wrath, there is recognition of God's grace and mercy. The psalmist pleads for God's compassion and forgiveness despite human failings. In the last half of this psalm, there is a shift in tone towards a prayer for wisdom and divine favor. The psalmist recognizes the brevity of life and implores God to teach His people to number their days, to gain a heart of wisdom. The psalm concludes with a plea for God's favor and blessings upon humanity, acknowledging that His grace is ultimately what sustains and restores His people. In summary, God's grace fits into Psalms 91-17 as the overarching theme that provides hope and redemption in the midst of the human predicament. Despite human frailty and sinfulness, God's grace is portrayed as enduring and sufficient to sustain His people through all generations. The psalmist's prayer for God's favor and wisdom reflects a reliance on His grace to navigate the challenges of life and find meaning in His eternal presence.
The Lord's Test. Psalm chapter 81, verses 7 and 8 refers to when the Israelites grumbled and complained against God and Moses due to lack of water during their journey in the wilderness. At Meribah, they challenged God's provision and questioned His presence among them. God's testing in this context isn't a trial to evaluate their knowledge or skills, but a test of their faithfulness, obedience, and trust in Him. The situation served as a means for God to reveal the hearts of the Israelites and to demonstrate His power and provision. This psalm and Psalm chapter 95 verses 7-11 serves as a reminder of the importance of remaining faithful to God's commandments, trusting in His provision, and acknowledging His sovereignty even in difficult times. It highlights the notion of divine testing as a means for spiritual growth, refinement, and ultimately, deeper trust in God's faithfulness. Psalm chapter 105 verses 17-22 recounts the story of Joseph from the book of Genesis. It narrates Joseph's journey from being sold into slavery by his brothers to his eventual rise to power in Egypt. The divine testing in these verses primarily revolves around Joseph's experiences and how they ultimately led to God's plan unfolding for the salvation of his family and the nation of Israel. Joseph's testing involves various trials and tribulations he faced, including betrayal by his brothers, being sold into slavery, and enduring false accusations and imprisonment in Egypt. Throughout these challenges, Joseph remained faithful to God, trusting in His plan despite the adversity he encountered. Joseph's story illustrates themes of perseverance, forgiveness, and the sovereignty of God. Despite the hardships he faced, Joseph maintained his integrity and remained steadfast in his faith, becoming a key figure in God's plan to preserve the nation of Israel and bring their redemption. The divine testing in this passage reflects God's faithfulness in fulfilling His promises and the transformative power of His providence, even in the midst of trials and suffering.
Deceitfulness of the wicked way. Psalm chapter 141 is a prayer of the psalmist, praying for several things. The psalmist asks for God's help in guarding his speech and actions against evil, particularly against sinful deeds and thoughts. He asks God to help him accept correction and guidance, rather than acting in the ways of the wicked. The psalmist prays for God to keep him from being tempted by the enticements of evildoers. His desire is to surround himself with righteous people who can correct him and provide positive influence. Psalm chapter 141, verse 4, acknowledges the danger of being enticed by the delicacies of evildoers. The term delicacies suggests something enticing, pleasurable, and alluring. It conveys the idea that temptation often presents itself in appealing and attractive forms, drawing individuals away from righteousness. The word delicacies also implies a gradual seduction, where the allure of sinful pleasures may start subtly, but can quickly lead to deeper involvement in wrongdoing if not resisted. The psalmist concludes by affirming his trust in God and his commitment to persistently seek God's presence and deliverance. Psalm chapter 1 verse 1, Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers. Psalm chapter 1 verse 1 suggests a gradual immersion into sinful behavior. It starts with merely walking alongside the wicked, progresses to standing in their way, and ultimately leads to sitting among them, becoming one with their company and adopting their ways.
Blessings of righteous living. In Psalms, several blessings are promised for those who revere the Lord. In Psalm chapter 1 verses 1 to 3, they are described as being blessed because they do not walk in the counsel of the wicked, stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of mockers. Their delight is in the law of the Lord, and they meditate on it day and night. They are like trees planted by streams of water, yielding fruit in season, and their leaves do not wither. Whatever they do prospers. In Psalm chapter 112 verses 1 to 9, their descendants will be mighty on the earth. Wealth and riches will be in their houses. They will have light in the darkness because they are gracious, compassionate, and righteous. They will be remembered forever. They will not fear bad news because their hearts are steadfast, trusting in the Lord. They will have no fear of disaster. Their hearts are secure, trusting in the Lord. They will freely give to the poor, and their righteousness endures forever. In Psalm chapter 128 verses 1 to 6, they will eat the fruit of their labor. They will be blessed, and it will go well with them. Their wives will be fruitful, like a fruitful vine within their house. Their children will be like olive shoots around their table. Indeed, they will be blessed to see their children's children. Peace will be upon them. Christians can see a connection between the blessings promised to Israel in the Old Testament and the broader spiritual blessings made available to all through Jesus Christ. The fulfillment of God's promises to Israel as extended to include Gentiles through faith in Jesus. In this view, the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant are realized through the death and resurrection of Jesus, encompassing a universal scope.
Thank you for studying with us. We hope you will give this video a like and please subscribe. And always, keep the faith of Jesus.